Welcome. I am Beverley Francis-Gibson, CEO of Together Women Rise, and I am so thrilled and delighted that you are joining us today for a special conversation with Nicholas Kristof. Together Women Rise is a powerful community of women and allies dedicated to achieving global gender equality. We are delighted to welcome our members, our friends, and guests who are joining us today for a special treat. I also wanted to highlight members who are hosting watch parties today and say a hi and send you a special shout out. Together Women Rise has been in existence for 22 years now, and the impact that we've had through our grant making has been tremendous. So I just wanted to share a few highlights with you. Together Women Rise has provided over $12 million of support to local NGOs in the global south. We have supported over 70 countries and over 260 projects in different parts of the world. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. It is my pleasure today to have a conversation with Nicholas Kristof, who is a columnist at the New York Times and a two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize. He grew up in Oregon and graduated from Harvard, earning degrees in law at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, and then he studied Arabic in Cairo. He was a foreign correspondent for the New York Times in Hong Kong, Beijing, Tokyo, and covered the presidential elections and served as editor of the Sunday New York Times. Nick, one of the things that many of the people in our audience do not know is that I wanted to be a journalist when I was growing up. And my mother discouraged me from doing and pursuing that. Actually, I do have a degree in journalism, but she discouraged that because she did not want me going into war zones and some of the things that you highlighted in your book about flying into the Congo and other places. And so I did not pursue a career in journalism, but I have
Our loss in journalism.
I know I have a fond memories of the work that I did briefly when I worked in that space. So we are delighted to have you join us today. We thought it would be wonderful to have you read a brief excerpt from your current book, Chasing Hope, which I have read here with me, and I have been reading. I haven't finished it, but I've been reading it. And share anything else that you'd like our audience to know about your work and where you are right now. And then we're going to jump into some questions and then open it up for our audience to ask questions that they would like of you.
Thank you, Beverly. And I did not know that you had this journalism background. But you know, you're well, our loss in journalism. But I'm so glad with about what you're doing with Together Women Rise. And I just want to take my non-existent hat here off to the members and supporters of Together Women Rise because you folks at a difficult time when things seem so frustrating. You guys are saving lives, helping women and girls, creating opportunity every day around the world. So thank you for that. And in terms of an excerpt, so maybe because this is kind of a bleak time and people are feeling a little overwhelmed and depressed, the title is indeed Chasing Hope. So let me try to read a passage that talks a little bit about hope. Uh,
Okay.
let's see. How can someone who, for decades, has been immersed in genocide, poverty, and disease believe in progress? Because I've seen that progress. When I was a child, a majority of all humans had always been illiterate. Now we're approaching 90% literacy. I remember when more than 35,000 children died each day around the world from hunger, diarrhea, and other causes. Now we're down to 13,000 dying daily. Still horrible, but so much better. When historians look back, I think they will identify surging well-being, health, and education as the most important trend underway in the early 21st century. So many people now live better lives and also get a chance to contribute to the world. One of my friends is Sultana, an Afghan woman who I originally met by email when she was a teenager confined to her family compound in Kandahar. The Taliban had closed schools for girls, so she had no chance to get a formal education, and she was living in one of the poorest countries in the world. She might have been destined to be one more illiterate and impoverished Afghan woman. Yet Sultana's compound had internet, and relatives gave her a laptop and books. She devoured them, and on the internet taught herself English. She moved on to math and science, teaching herself calculus and struggling with string theory and quantum mechanics. She reached out by email to an American professor of astrophysics who was intrigued to get cogent questions about advanced mathematics from a teenage girl in Afghanistan who had never graduated from elementary school. He introduced her to me, and I helped her get a visa to study at a university in America. That's how the world is changing, how opportunity is being created, how more people are getting a chance to make this a better world. It's the kind of thing that fills me with hope.
Beautiful, beautiful. I remember that as I started your book, and that very first line talks about what journalism hope for or aspire for, aspire to accomplish. One of the things I was wondering was how did you find the experience of writing Chasing Hope, a memoir about your own life, and you actually shared some tidbits about other journalists and the contributions that they have made to not only the profession but to our world. So compared to your other previous reporting on nonfiction books, how did you find this experience of writing Chasing Hope?
It's a lot more personal. It requires, negotiation with my wife Cheryl about what to include, this kind of thing. Um, and but it's also, I mean, I wanted to write a little bit about journalism partly because, I mean, journalism is now, frankly, under
Yes.
attack.
Yes.
There is a crisis in the business model, and there's also a crisis of trust. And we have a president who's calling journalists enemies of the people. And look, there is plenty of bad journalism. I certainly don't want to be in the position of defending all journalism, but I have lost friends who have been trying to report, trying to shine a light on conditions that needed that attention. And I think that at its best, journalism really can be a lever for change to call attention to things, to make people spill their coffee and do some good here and there. And that's one of the things I wanted to highlight.
And you did that very well. I actually felt like I knew you and I could envision life on the farm in Oregon. And I love the stories that you shared about your family, your parents particularly, and their own histories in terms of the role that they played in history. And I wondered, as you write about covering many of the world's major crises, human tragedies over the span of your career, what type of emotional toll has that taken on you, your family, and what was it like to revisit those experiences?
Yeah, and in terms of my family, can I just say a little bit about my dad? Because I
Yes,
think that
please.
people, I think that for a lot of folks out there, there's this discouraging sense that the problems of the world are so vast that anything we do is just a drop in the bucket. And, in a sense, there is something to that. We're not gonna solve the problem of girls' education. We're not going to solve the problem of child marriage. But so in that sense, what we do is a drop in the bucket, but I'm a believer in drops in the bucket, partly because of my dad's story. And my dad was a World War II refugee from Eastern Europe, in concentration camps, an asbestos mine, and then in 1952, a family here in Oregon sponsored his way to the U.S. And that did not solve the global refugee problem. It didn't make a dent in the global refugee problem, but it was completely transformative for my family. And
Yes.
in the same way, we have the tools with modest amounts of effort and money not to solve problems in their entirety, but to make a completely transformative difference for particular girls, particular families around the world by, getting them an education, things like that. And so that's, I find that very motivating that, yeah, I can transform a life for, fairly easily. Um, Now, in terms of the toll it took on me, I think that journalists traditionally, war correspondents, that we were full of a very kind of macho ethos, and you didn't really talk about the things the trauma you were enduring, and or just, I mean, just being held at gunpoint by child soldiers or drunken soldiers. The Chasing Hope begins, as you know, on the first page with a plane crash, with a
Yes.
plane crash in
Yes.
Congo, and I thought I was going to die. I mean, it was terrifying, and so I kind of just bulldozed through that. And then covering the Darfur genocide again took a, a, a big toll. It was just terrifying. I mean, you were terrified for yourself. You were terrified for your interpreter, your driver, that you might get them killed. Um, and uh, so it was really in writing the book that I kind of realized that, hey, I think I suffered from a sort of mild PTSD along the way.
Hmm.
And I think that I was helped by having, Cheryl and a loving kids to return
Yes.
to. Um, I also took steps, in retrospect, it was that time that I began doing a lot of backpacking. And my daughter and I backpacked from Mexico to Canada on the Pacific Crest Trail. And I,
Wow.
I think that was a sort of wilderness therapy. Uh, we here on the farm in Oregon, we produce. We have wine grapes and cider apples. We make our Pinot Noir wine and hard cider, which we sell through our little brand, Kristof Farms, and and it's
Yes. Nice.
it's my little sandbox. And in my day job, I shout at the world and tell it what to do, and it pays no attention. But on the farm, I've got, the apples listen to me, the grapes listen to me. And so that is kind of healing and reassuring and very, very tangible.
That's beautiful. I also think reading about your dad and your mom, it reinforced for me the ethos, the message that one person can make a difference. And in your family's own little way, they have, and you're doing that as well. At what point did you realize that you wanted to write more specifically about the challenges that women and girls face around the world? And why do you think it's important to highlight those challenges to others?
So I think that, initially I resisted it because look, I was this hard-hitting foreign correspondent, and the issues that were perceived as important for foreign correspondents, it was, nuclear negotiations, it was issues of war and peace and things like that. And human trafficking, female genital mutilation. These were not issues that were being discussed at the Council on Foreign Relations. But there were a couple of things that pushed me in that direction. And one was I covered the Tiananmen Square massacre in China in 1989. And that, again, I mean, that really shook me to see army use modern weapons of war against a crowd of peaceful protesters, especially
Mhm.
when I'm in the crowd and people around me are being shot. And we don't know, but probably around 400 to 800 people were killed that day, Beverley,
Yes.
Beijing. And meanwhile, later that year, I found that 30,000 infant Chinese girls were dying each year because they didn't have the same access to food and healthcare that boys did. And we'd never written a paragraph about that. And I thought, okay, if these 400, 800 people are important and, are on the front page for weeks, then shouldn't we be paying some attention to this much larger number of girls who were dying every year, day in, day out? And so that's when I began to look at the issue. And then for that reason, I did what I thought was going to be one piece about sex trafficking. And I went to Cambodia and I came across a village where there were young girls, very young girls, who'd been kidnapped from their villages and were locked up in brothels and were being sold for their virginity. And they were terrified. It felt to me like what I imagined 19th century slavery had been, except these girls were already dead of AIDS by the early
Mhm.
20s. And that really shook me. Um, and so then kind of in spite of myself, I began writing about it more. And then I also saw that, it wasn't just the terrible things that were happening, but also if you wanted to have positive change, if you wanted to address the world's problems, then educating girls and
Yes.
bringing those educated women into the labor force, giving them more voice in families and societies was a really powerful way to bring about change. And so, from both the point of view of social justice and from the point of view of providing solutions to and a path forward, it seemed that investing in girls was something that deserved a lot more attention. And so and Cheryl was a great teacher about that too.
Mhm.
Having a strong woman as a wife is
Yes.
a good education in itself. And so that was the beginning of the path.
Wonderful. I will tell you that just reading those stories that you've written over time about the impact of war, of human trafficking, of genital mutilation on young girls, that has also impacted the work that Together Women Rise does and the funding that we provide to nonprofits around the world that are trying to address those issues. And one of the things that our grantees always say to Together Women Rise is, thank you for not forgetting us. Thank you for being in this fight with us. And I think your highlighting those stories also helps them know that they're not forgotten, and they're not left behind by society or by the world. So I just wanted to also thank you for highlighting those important stories.
Well,
I also,
I thank
and
you
I
for providing a path. So many Americans want to help, but they don't really know how to help, who to give to,
yes,
and then their business school calls up and says, "Oh, we have a naming opportunity. You can name the toilet seat here." And so, oh,
exactly.
really? And if instead people have the opportunity to support organizations in the field that are doing a lot of good, and
Yes.
which is what you're doing. You're providing that connective tissue. That's great, obviously, for the beneficiaries in the field. It's also great for Americans.
Oh, and it's great for us because we are meeting women and men from around the world that we probably would have never met. And hearing their stories and being able to support them and elevating the work that they're trying to do in their respective countries, that has been, I mean, indirect impact that we could have never, ever imagined or measured. One of the things I know we both share is the belief that men and boys must be a part of the solution, and strong allies in the fight for gender equality. Can you speak to this? I know you've talked a little bit about your own experience, but how else can we convince men to be advocates and to help us in this endeavor?
Yeah. Look, if only women talk about women's rights, then the issue is marginalized. And so, it has always, I think, seemed a little strange to some readers of the New York Times to have a man writing about these issues. But it's precisely for that reason that I think look, civil rights weren't an issue just for African Americans.
Yes.
LGBT rights weren't just an issue for gay Americans. And when you have so many women and girls who are denied education, denied opportunity, that's not just a women's issue. That's a human rights
Exactly.
issue for all of us. And so I think it's important for men to join that effort. I mean, and I should say also that, you know, internationally, the gender issue means women and girls being left behind, not getting the same opportunity. Domestically in the US, there are real problems that men and boys are facing. And that likewise has to be an issue where American women are also looking out for boys who are being left behind, that
Yes.
all these issues require all of us together to try to address.
I agree. I totally agree. So, one of the burning questions is, what's happening in terms of USAID cuts, and the decisions that are being made currently that are impacting our friends and partners around the world. Can you share with us some of what you're hearing? What are some of the trends that you're seeing?
I mean, it's frankly, it's pretty heartbreaking. I I've made three reporting trips to Africa this year. One to Kenya and South Sudan, one to Sierra Leone and Liberia, and most recently to Uganda. And in each case, you know, Secretary of State Marco Rubio says that no one has died because of U.S. aid cuts. When you go to the village, you go village, you see household after household, you see children dying for really simple things, for lack of a $2 mosquito net to prevent malaria, for want of, a few dollars worth of anti-malarial medication or antibiotics or whatever it may be. Um, Children dying of malnutrition, even as the U.S. is paying $10,000 a day to store, plumping out the emergency food that is given to kids with malnutrition in a warehouse in Rhode Island. So I mean, we are paying to store it, and meanwhile, kids are dying for lack of it. Um,
Right.
and it's you know, it's just heartbreaking to see the scale of this. All the numbers are deeply uncertain, but one estimate is that throughout the Trump presidency, 88 children will die each hour, every hour for the rest of the Trump presidency because of the U.S. aid cuts. And, you know, all is not lost. There are some elements of aid that are continuing, and in the world of HIV and AIDS, there's actually one good thing happening, which is that a um, lenacapavir, which is a preventive medication, is
Medication.
now going to be distributed by USAID, and and that's great. But overall, just a huge setback for humanity. And,
Mhm.
when people struggle, it's disproportionately women and girls who tend to suffer the most. And, in Uganda in particular, I saw a lot of child marriages and, teenage girls who the families can't feed them, don't really know what to do with them. And so there's pressure to marry them off, in some cases, to
Yes.
be the second or third wife of some guy who's, three times their age. And it just, we're, we, and this had, I think what also frustrates me is there really had been a bipartisan consensus that humanitarian aid is a good thing, that we can save a lot of lives. The PEPFAR, the big anti-AIDS program, that was a project of evangelicals and President George W. Bush. Um, and yet somehow we've lost that consensus.
Yeah, it feels like we're going back in time,
It does.
unfortunately.
Yeah, it's
I know in 2009, you and your wife Cheryl published Half the Sky. That book is now a classic. Some call it a Bible of sorts on the cause for investing in women and girls. Of course, like we just discussed, a lot has changed since then. How do you feel about the progress that has occurred in the past 16 years since Half the Sky was published?
um, oh, the progress has been enormous. And indeed, one of the things I sometimes worry about is that whether we're journalists, whether we're, aid workers, whether we're, activists, that we tend to talk so much about the problem. So we leave this misleading impression that everything is always going wrong. And in fact, the
Yes.
backdrop for so much of this, and certainly for global gender opportunities, is enormous progress. If you look at education, um, there in primary schools worldwide, there is no longer a gender gap. Girls are as likely to attend primary school worldwide as boys are, which is just stunning. And it means that women in the future will be about as likely to be literate as men are, which again is a complete
Yes.
transformation of opportunity. Um,
Yes.
Maternal mortality, has dropped by about half since we wrote Half the Sky. And there has been some real effort on human trafficking, so that, it's still a huge problem. But that was an interesting case where liberal feminists worked together with evangelical bleeding hearts and, disagreed about so much about abortion rights, about all kinds of things, but they all cared passionately that 14-year-old girls should not be kidnapped and locked up in brothels. And so the US put pressure on these countries. And there was one brothel I used to write about in Cambodia. I used to go visit it periodically, and the because of that pressure from the U.S., they didn't close it down, but the police began to demand more in bribes to leave it open. And that just changed, that undermined the business model of this brothel. And so the owner closed it and turned it into a grocery store. And, look, this is an imperfect ending. There was no justice for all the kidnappings and abuse and rape that girls there had endured. But because of a modest amount of pressure from Washington, girls are no longer being kidnapped and enduring rapes every day there. And so it was sort of a reminder of the opportunities for progress. So overall, there's been a lot of progress. Unfortunately, a lot of that has become undone in
Yes.
the last year, and um, so we're now going backward on some of those metrics.
Unfortunately. 2 years ago, Together Women Rise, for example, we host trips to visit our grantees in different parts of the world. And 2 years ago, I had the privilege to travel to India. While we were on the bus, we heard, I think the driver turned on his radio, and there was a report that about 20 men had been arrested for who had married young children. And I remember we were applauding the fact that they had been arrested because that's something that we're obviously supporting, but we sometimes don't hear the results on the other end of what happened. And it's similarly to what you were saying about education. We visited schools where the girls were telling us about their aspirations to become attorneys and lawyers and judges. And it was just so inspiring to see that they are now leaders in their communities. They were literally stopping traffic for us to cross the street.
Oh, that's great.
Um, and many of them, were saying to me, Beverly, as CEO of Together Women Rise, what can you do to help us come to the United States so that we can complete our education or to be a part of change and making change? And so there are, highlights, obviously, of what's happening around the world, but it's also so right now discouraging. And I know that with the work that you're doing around reporting, how has climate change amplified the challenges for women and girls in the global South? Have you seen any things there that we should address or we should be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. And just let me pick up a point on your previous point about your visits. I think that one of the real elements of progress as these issues have come to the fore has to do with what we can talk about. And I've always thought that both domestically and internationally, our policies tend to be worst at the things that we find it hard to talk about because they involve uncomfortable subjects. It's, in I would like AIDS killed so many more people than was necessary because it involves sexual transmission, and we found that awkward to talk about. But because women have been more involved in these issues, so for example, it's everybody is now fine talking about how menstruation is an obstacle to girls going to school. And once
Yes,
you can actually talk about that, then you can begin to address it. Fistulas, obstetric fistulas were an issue
yes,
that, you couldn't really talk about because it involved vaginas. And,
exactly.
this is sort of impolite. But now, once you can, then you can begin to actually repair fistulas and provide care so women don't get fistulas in the first place. And so just the ice is broken in a lot of ways that I think have made it easier to tackle some of these problems. And that's, thanks to you folks and all those working in the field and just being willing to talk frankly about some of these difficult topics. Um,
I agree.
Climate change, I think, is clearly magnifying a lot of these existing problems. And I've seen in Madagascar and in Bangladesh, for example, how when families face drought because of climate change or rising seas, when they become impoverished, then one of the first coping mechanisms they have is to marry off their young daughters because
Yes.
they don't have food, don't have resources, don't they want to have one less food, one less mouth to feed. In many parts of the world, there's also a bride price. So if you marry off your daughter, then you get uh,
Right.
some money, and so I think that's there are a lot of there are a lot of 13, 14-year-old girls who are paying the price for our carbon emissions and our failure to
Yes.
grapple with that problem. And beyond that, there like we have enormous problems in the Sahel region of West Africa, the kind of the Sahara Desert countries there, and they're large regions that are becoming that are less able to support villages and families, herds of animals, and when that happens, one thing that people do is they move. They try to move to Europe. They risk their lives trying to cross the Mediterranean. Another thing that happens is you tend to get conflict. You get conflict between farmers and herders. You get conflicts between different villages, different regions, different ethnic groups, and you've there are large areas in those Sahel countries that are now enduring brutal terrorism, civil war, and conflict. And it's a lot more complicated than just climate change, but climate change is one of the elements that is driving
Yes.
this kind of conflict. And that is, that's devastating to women and men alike.
I would agree. I would agree. I'm also interested in hearing about your readers' reaction to the column, The Tax on Being a Girl, and other columns that you write on global issues.
So, um, so that was an article that I wrote recently from Uganda about how women and girls were disproportionately paying the price of the Trump aid cuts. And, it wasn't that Trump was so much saying, okay, aid is just going to go to boys or just to men. But part of it is that when families are struggling, there often is a internal bias in favor of boys. So if there isn't enough food to go around, you give a little more to your son and a little less to your daughter.
Yes.
I remember one person telling me years ago, it stuck with me that, when your son is sick, you take him to the doctor. When your daughter is sick, you feel her forehead and say, well, let's see how you're doing tomorrow. And, the upshot is higher mortality. Uh, Ambulance services have been cut in many places, and the upshot is that women who need C-sections instead die of
Yeah.
obstructed labor. And so the um, so I write about this. I mean, I wish I could tell you that, there was an overwhelming reaction and everybody is rushing to write their member of Congress and so on. But frankly, Beverly, I think there is some weariness with the world's problems, and people are very focused inward, understandably, because of all
Yes.
the
Yes.
domestic crises we're facing. And to the extent that they're looking abroad, they're often looking at Gaza in the Middle East, or they're looking at Ukraine, and there's just kind of limited bandwidth for, for other more distant places. Um,
Right.
and so that is one of the things I try to write about in Chasing Hope, how we can kindle that kind of interest. And I think that's partly about storytelling. Uh, it's, uh, it's some combination of storytelling and an argument about why we have interests as well as values at stake.
And also highlighting some of the wins, highlighting some of the good things that are happening in spite of, because I think one of the things that I'm hearing from nonprofits around the world is that it has forced them, as crises always do, to become creative and innovative in how they do their work. We've also heard from nonprofits who've indicated they've had to close their doors because they couldn't support the people in their communities and stakeholders that they've always wanted to support. But out of those stories, there are also glimmers of hope and glimmers of successes, if you will, of people coming together that never had worked together before. And they're having to think differently about how they deliver services. So I
Oh,
agree. Storytelling is powerful. I grew up in the Caribbean, and a lot of what I know is through stories from my family members and my grandmother. Um, how do we get people to care more about what's happening? And I agree with you. There's apathy right now. There's a sense of isolation, people just not knowing who to believe anymore in media, which we touched on earlier. How do we get people to think about those of us that are beyond the US borders? And I always say Together Women Rise is one of the best kept secrets in the US, but we're one entity, one nonprofit. How do we get others to care and to advocate for the needs of others?
um, So I wrestled with it. I tell the story in Chasing Hope. I wrestled with this when I was covering the Darfur genocide, and I was going off and writing these stories about hundreds of thousands of people being slaughtered, and meanwhile, and it just felt like they were disappearing without a ripple. And meanwhile, in New York, some folks watching may remember that there were these two hawks, two red-tailed hawks that were living in a building right next to Central Park, and the building didn't like the droppings, the bird droppings, and so it dismantled their nest. And all of a sudden, all of New York City is up in arms about these two homeless hawks. And I thought, how is it that New Yorkers are full of compassion for these two homeless hawks and want to help and care and show they, have these great moral values and yet are indifferent to all that I'm writing about hundreds of thousands of people being slaughtered? How do
Mm,
I make people care as much about Darfuris as
yes,
they do about these two hawks? And so that led me to the work in social psychology and neuroscience about what makes us care. And it's
yes,
fundamentally, I think, about two things. It's about um, individual stories that we have empathy for. We're hardwired to show some empathy for individuals, but not for classes of people. And
mm,
the moment the empathy declines is not when n equals 100 or n equals 1,000 or a million. It's when n equals 2. So,
mm,
it really helps to start with an individual story to open those ducts of compassion, and then you build. And the other thing is that um, people want to be part of something positive. And so if we focus on all that is going wrong, then people just kind of tune out. It's just
yes,
demoralizing. And if you think about that, I mean, basically, we get both points wrong in the world. We tend to, draw the journalists or advocacy groups, we tend to say, there are X million, people dying from
right,
this, or X, X million girls being married as children, whatever. And and then secondarily, we focus so much on the problems that I think we don't acknowledge what is possible to change. And so I think that the path to getting people to care is to prime the pump with individual stories. And then, secondly, to show that, if people donate, if people get involved, that they can actually have a real impact,
yes.
on a number of people and transform their outcomes. And both are very true.
I would agree. One of the things that I learned in journalism, and I see it on the news when I do watch it, is that there's like 16 bad stories and then the one human interest story at the very end that's intended to make you feel better after you've been depressed
Yeah.
throughout the
Yeah.
story, the broadcast. And I do agree. I think if we flipped it a little bit, infuse some of those positive things that are happening along with here's what's happening, in terms of the world, that might make some of us tune in more. But like we talked about it previously, it seems just so daunting and so negative lately. And after a while, to just preserve your own well-being, you tune out, you stop watching. And I don't know if that is the way that we want to continue reporting, because then we lose the people that care, and that the people that could help advocate for changes and causes around the world. But I do agree.
And despair is paralyzing. Hope is potentially empowering, and it's not, this glib kind of Panglossian, oh, everything's going to work out fine. It's not a complacent hope, but it's a sense that, okay, if we put our shoulder to the wheel together, we have a chance of moving.
Yes.
And that's what you and your members do every day. And so thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. In closing, I just wanted to ask if there's anything else you would like to share with our audience today, anything that comes to mind or to heart that you would like to say to us before we open up for questions.
Um, just that, I mean, I'm just I'm really grateful to um, you know to readers who um, look, as writers, whether as authors of books or as writers of articles in the New York Times, then we want people to read us. But it's even more heartening and inspiring when people not only read the article or the book, but then go and do things like, join a chapter of Together Women Rise or take on some other project. And that is just so uplifting and heartening. And, covering these kinds of things can be pretty overwhelming and grim. And you see kids dying, and you end up at these scary checkpoints with child soldiers and so on. But what makes it all so totally worth it is the sense that one's having an impact and that readers are actually acting after that. So just, thanks to all those folks who are responding.
Yeah, and I do think one of our other elements of Together Women Rise is that we have advocacy. We have an advocacy chapter, and we have over 200 members that are part of that, who are writing letters, who are calling their legislative representatives. And I do believe that that's also another part of what people can do, because several times I've heard people say, "Well, I don't know what I can do." And sometimes it's just writing a letter or picking up the phone and making a phone call. And our advocacy group actually gives you the script. So it's not like you have to create it. So I do want to encourage people who are joining us today to think about other ways that they can plug in, get involved, and be a part of what we hope to be the solutions moving forward. At this time, I want to just ask if I think I've been seeing a number of comments in the chat, and I wanted to lift up some of the questions that have been coming from our viewers. And I want to thank all of the guest members, watch party participants that are joining us today. So, Wendy, questions for Nick? I'm trying to scroll back through all of the questions that we've been getting.
I know there's an awful lot in the chat, Beverly, so let me help you out a little bit. So
Thanks.
one of the questions was about whether your comments on the recent New York Times op-ed that the loss of USAID and other government foreign aid funding is in fact encouraging or empowering global countries in the global South to step up themselves.
So there's no doubt that some governments in some of the better run countries have been responding, and ministries of health have been trying to take ownership. And so, I saw that in Sierra Leone, for example, in Kenya. Um, but the problem was that this, the collapse of USAID came so abruptly, so suddenly, and often mid-year in the budget cycle. So there just weren't resources to make up for that. And, you know, one and some people have told me that, look, in the long run, this can lead health ministries in the developing world to take more ownership of their health sector. And, the decisions probably are going to be better made if they're made in Nairobi or Kampala or Freetown versus in Washington. And there is an element of truth to that. But in the meantime, there are folks who are dying each day. And, meanwhile, like in South Sudan, you're not seeing that at all. And money is flowing instead to weapons for a civil war that the country may be falling into. And so I'm not as optimistic as some folks are that, there may indeed be a silver lining here, but it's a pretty thin silver lining. And meanwhile, they're just people are, large numbers of people are going to die.
Unfortunate.
Another question we have is in regards to the defunding of federal data programs. So in the areas of climate, health, labor, economic reporting, and that they're creating dangerous blind spots. This long-term data continuity is threatened as in the series analysis. What suggestions do you have for us on how we as a society can combat this problem?
Well, it's true that, I mean, one reason why it's hard to measure the consequences of some of these defundings is that one of the things being defunded is the measurement of those consequences. And
Exactly.
so um, that's, that is indeed a big problem. And it's a problem both domestically and internationally. Um, there are some folks, there's a data collection effort overseen at the University of Washington, IHME, that is trying to do a robust job with data estimation. But this is a big problem, and it's hard to target your resources the best if you don't have good measurements of what is going on. Um, I don't think that just given the immense needs in other areas, I don't know to what extent other countries are going to step up and provide some of that data collection. So I think that's a really hard problem and not one that is easily solvable.
Another
So
question
unfortunate.
sort of along the same lines, you're seeing the disappearing of information and increasing censorship of the media. Do you worry about your sources disappearing with this increased censorship of media?
So look, I've spent much of my career in authoritarian countries, and um, you know, suddenly that experience feels a lot more relevant when I report in the U.S. in a sad way.
Yes.
And um, I don't think that I'm going to be sent to Guantanamo. I don't think that my internet is going to be cut off. I don't think the New York Times is going to be closed. But what we are seeing is pressure on news organizations. And I don't think that that pressure is going to cripple the New York Times, for example, because we have this very strong belief in what we're doing and a willingness to take risks. And I think journalists feel that this is why we went into journalism, to cover really historic turning points like today. But what we are seeing is that news organizations that are owned by companies that have other interests, they are pulling back. because they don't want to risk their other assets, their other business lines. And so, we've seen that at the Washington Post, at CBS, at ABC, at the Los Angeles Times. And I think that is going to be an ongoing problem. And I think also the vehemence that is directed at journalists, it may get people killed.
Yeah.
We, uh, you know, I, I, I'm more, I mean, I used to be that I was concerned about my security when I was in Sudan. Now I'm also a little more cautious in the US, and we have some security measures in place to, to try to protect us. And so all these things are concerns, but at the end of the day, uh, is the administration going to be able to silence the media? No, I don't believe so. I think that we will continue to be watchdogs, not lapdogs. And I think, in journalism, we take that very seriously. And we feel that kind of the eyes of history are on us. And historians will look back in 50 years at what were we doing in 2025, 2026, and so on. Um,
Yeah.
so, you know,
Yeah.
onward.
I wanted to end, Nick, thank you for that, with telling our audience, what are you reading? What types of books, media are you turning to for comfort, for inspiration that you can share with us?
Um, the, you know, I wonder if this is true generally that, look, I always read nonfiction for my work. Whereas I'm just reading this book about the Middle East right now by Hussein Agha and Robert Malley, two longtime peace negotiators. Um, and I'm always reading, nonfiction. But I think I'm reading more fiction these days, especially kind of cheap, kind of dumb fiction, kind of escapist fiction, thrillers,
Yeah.
just to, as distraction, in the same way that, making Pinot Noir and running our little wine business is this kind of nice distraction to tug me away from all these other things. Um, well,
Lovely.
uh, maybe
You're
one
breaking up a little bit now, Nick.
recommendations for. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, maybe I said a moment ago that I wasn't going to lose internet, so maybe somebody was listening. Um, and but
Yeah, you were talking about the
if you want,
winery, your, yeah, yeah, just making your
it's
own wine and being a part of that.
yeah, it's just this, it's also this little escape. I didn't know that I had an entrepreneurial bone particularly, but all of a sudden, trying to make and sell wine is it's been this nice fun escape, a little bit like reading some of this escapist fiction.
Yes. I think I sent you a message on Facebook, but I loved your spoof on what's happening in Oregon. Um, so it was it was hilarious. And a lighter side to, again, some of the information that's being put out there. So thank you for that too.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, one of the things I learned in covering authoritarianism is that the impulse, I think, especially in intellectual circles, is to make these very earnest arguments about freedom of expression and democracy. And, those, yes, we need those, but often the most powerful critiques are those of mockery, those that make
Yes.
fun of would-be autocrats. And
Yes.
so, yeah, that was my little effort on Facebook to poke some fun at the administration.
It was hilarious. And I know I saw a number of comments from other people who actually just tagged on to the, the gist of it, and it was fun. So I want to just share, as we're coming down to our last 5 minutes, I want to just share with our members and our friends and guests today how much Together Women Rise appreciates this opportunity to have this honest chat with you, Nick. You have been very easy to work with, and I personally, as CEO of Together Women Rise, just thank you for being brave and being courageous and inspiring all of us and giving us hope. And just know that we hope that we can continue to share the book and encourage people to get it if they have not. Because like I said, I'm reading it as well. Our entire board and staff have copies, and many of them have read it, or many of our members have read it. And I think in light of what we have been discussing today, it's really a nice opportunity to escape and to learn a little bit more about you and your family and the contributions that you've made and are making to our world. So I wanted to thank you.
Well, I'm honored, and yeah, these are times when maybe we need a little bit of hope, when we can't all be chasing hope together. And you guys are help not just chasing hope, but you're help creating that hope.
Yes, thank you. Before we adjourn today, I just wanted to share that Together Women Rise has launched our special annual appeal. We are inviting all of you to help us to rise to meet the moment. Our goal is to raise over $800,000 so that we can support additional grants to the Global South. Due to the generosity of several of our donors, we are announcing a $100,000 match to every contribution that's made to Together Women Rise through October 31st. So your donation will be matched dollar for dollar. And later this year, our goal is to announce how much we've raised and how many more organizations we will be funding with your help. So if you're looking for a way to give back, if you're looking for a way to do something, please support Together Women Rises Rise to Meet the Moment annual appeal. You can do that right now. I have the QR code behind me that you can literally scan on your phone as we speak and make a donation to support grantees across the Global South and support women and girls. We received over 675 grant applications this year. This is a record number based on the needs that we're hearing about and that we're seeing. And if you could support us, it would go a long way to ensuring that women and girls know that they're not forgotten and supporting our grantees. Again, I want to thank our staff. I would like to thank all of our members, those of you who are having and hosting watch parties, all of the friends, Nick's friends who are also joining us today, and friends of Together Women Rise and family members who heard about this event and said, I need to be here. You have helped to make this an important conversation in light of what's happening today, and we are chasing hope. And thank you, Nick, for helping us to do that so eloquently every day. Thank you
Truly,
and have a good afternoon.
be well.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.